Welcome to the Biz Gone Social Podcast. We help entrepreneurs navigate how to get known, get customers, and get the edge over their competition. Here is your host, Lorraine Duncan.
So here we are with episode 39, and I'm so glad to be here. And I'm glad that my guest today is Meryl Lochner, and I'm so glad that she's here. And she's not new to this podcast. She came on before and talked about the power of a story. So this month, I'm going to be talking about podcasts. And my promise is always to use just to give you a little bit of verbal caffeine that's going to energize your social media, your business, and your marketing. And it's going to help you stay social. So with a lot of thought into this month's theme and why I chose to talk a lot about podcasts, I mean, really, what's a social media person talking about podcasts? But the reason being is that a lot of people have been asking me about why should I have a podcast? Should I have a podcast? And I figure what a better person to come on and talk about podcasts is someone who produces podcasts on a daily basis. So Meryl, just tell a little bit about yourself so we can, so the audience can be familiar with you.
Sure, not a problem. Born and raised down here on Long Island. Taught myself how to read at 2.5, was a published author by the time I was 9. And when I got into after college, I decided, well, I can either write the great American novel or I can have health insurance. So I decided to go into corporate America and worked in corporate marketing for 30 years, primarily working with scientists, engineers, lawyers, computer programmers, people who were really, really, really smart, but forgot how to speak to normal people without devolving into jargon. So I pretty much spent 30 years translating gobbledygook back into human and telling stories. And I've always been a storyteller. And I was really into hockey at one point, just started getting into it. And I started listening to like 14 hours of hockey podcasts every week, driving to and from work. I had an hour-and-a-half commute each way. And I realized what an incredible format for long-form storytelling, especially for businesses. So I went up to my local chamber of commerce and said, you guys should have a podcast. And they went, what a great idea. Go start one. And that was my first podcast, sitting down with business owners and interviewing them, an independent bookstore owner. How do you compete against Amazon? And I ended up interviewing my dentist, who ended up learning how to be a dentist in the Army. And it was just talking to people and finding their stories. And it was an extraordinary success. So that's when I added podcasting to my marketing consultancy business, and it's taken off ever since.
And just real quickly, just because there may be a few people that may not know what a podcast is, could you just maybe in 1 or 2 sentences kind of describe what a podcast is?
Well, if you've ever listened to NPR, that's just pretty much a series of podcasts, one after the other. It is radio on demand. It is interviews and stories and entertainment and plays and panel discussions that you can just listen to on your phone, that you can download on your computer, that you can listen to while you drive, that you can listen to while you jog. There are currently over 2 million podcasts out there on any topic you can imagine, and probably some that you couldn't imagine and will surprise you. So if you can write about it, if there's a blog about it, there's probably a podcast about it.
And, in your experience and over the years that you've been doing it, or I don't know, how long did you start? About maybe a year, 2 years now?
Oh, about 5 years.
Oh, 5 years. Okay. Do you think people actually listen to podcasts?
Oh, 1 in 5 Americans listen to at least one podcast every week. And 70% of Americans either know what a podcast is, 50% of Americans have listened to at least one. Especially if you have a long commute, podcasts are the number one thing to listen to in a car. Then again, during the pandemic, people who were listening to it at home, while they were cleaning, while they were jogging, on a treadmill. Any place that you want to learn something and you're too busy to use your eyes, wherever you listen to music, you can listen to a podcast.
Yeah, that's true. I listen to it in my car. I listen to it in the shower sometimes, although sometimes I can't hear it because then I decide to sing. So that's pretty bad. But anyways, what I was going to ask you, do you think, how do I word this? Do you think that it's important for someone like, me who owns my own business, or for other business owners out there to have a podcast?
It really depends. My mom teases me that sounds like I spend 50% of my time explaining to people that they don't need a podcast. A podcast is great storytelling. It's great verbal. Podcasts are great for lawyers because, face it, what are they going to do? Do a video and say, hey, everyone, look at this pretty contract I just wrote. Wherein chefs, unless you're talking about the business of a restaurant, no one wants to hear about your food. They want to see it. So there are certain industries that are much more visual and certain industries that are much more verbal. And podcasts work great for the storytellers. So I tell people in restaurants, if you want to talk about the challenge of running a restaurant and tell the stories about a restaurant, that's great. If you're trying to sell your food, podcasts aren't what you want. So it really depends on the business. It's what do you want to talk about? And you also have to remember, like any marketing, who is your audience? You have 2 million podcasts to choose from. Why is anyone going to want to listen to yours? Because if you're saying, well, I want to tell them all about my product, that's not a podcast. It's a sales pitch. And people who listen to podcasts are very hypersensitive to sales pitches. And the minute they think they're being lectured or sold to, boop, they're going to go off and they're going to look for something else. So if you want to do a podcast, you have to be able to educate and not lecture and not sell.
Right. And I actually think that's a really important sentence that you just said, is like, you really do. You want to be, if you're going to do a podcast, you really have to educate. Because if you're going to get on to a podcast and say, buy my stuff, it's not going to work. So my next question is that, can anybody start a podcast? And should anybody, meaning should someone do it by themselves? I mean,
they can. Here is like anything. You are always going to have to pay in either time or dollars. So yes, anyone can do a podcast. Anyone could do a very cheap podcast. All you need is a phone these days. But again, how much time and or money are you willing to put into this? Because if you do it all yourself, it could be a big time suck. I tell people starting a podcast is like starting a business. You better have a plan worked out. How are you going to format it? Are you going to interview people? Are you going to have a panel? Is it going to be monetized? Are you going to allow commercials and hopefully make a few bucks out of it? Or are you going to put it behind a paywall? Are you going to do it once a month? Are you going to do it once a week? How much time are you willing to put into this? Because, if you have nothing better to do, rock on, do a podcast, talk about Star Trek for 52 episodes, whatever. But just realize that there's a thing called pod fade, which usually means podcasts can sometimes go 3, 4, 5 episodes. And by the 6th episode, well, I'm kind of busy. I'll skip this week. Or I have to deal with my clients, or I'm not feeling it. The average podcast, you will usually last 10 episodes before pod fade hits, some as little as 3.
Wow. And so do you think that people should, do you think people should really have a plan in place before they even start a podcast?
Oh, absolutely. It's like starting a business. Have a plan together. And you're asking yourself the basic questions. Why am I doing this? What is it for? What is result I'm expecting? Am I hoping to monetize it? Am I doing it as a hobby, as I'm trying to help my business? Who's going to listen? Why are they going to listen? What do I want them to do? Do I want to get them to give me business? Do I want simply them to think I'm a thought leader? What is the result why are you doing this, and what is the result you're hoping for? If you're just doing it because it sounds fun, rock on, go for it. Just realize it's a lot of work. There's multiple steps to get it done. And unless you have a reason to do it, it's going to stop being fun after a while.
Yeah. I always tell people, you already have a full-time job, so you kind of don't need another full-time job. That you really want to think carefully before you start a podcast. So an interesting question that people ask me all the time too is, how do you make money at podcasting? So how does one make money at podcasting?
Well, it really depends. Most of my clients are commercial podcasters, so what they're doing is pure education and thought leadership. They want to be viewed experts in their specific field. And so they make money by people listening to their podcast and going, wow, this person can help me solve this specific problem I have. I have one guy in cybersecurity. He's made over $500,000 from a single podcast episode we did 2 years ago. He's still getting calls on it because it's evergreen content. Most people monetize their podcast through advertising. You can place your podcast on any series of podcast networks. There is Anchor FM, there is Buzzsprout. There's a number of them that once you get up to 1,000 downloads every episode, you'll start making a little money on the advertising. And so you have to be open to the fact that in the middle of your podcast, suddenly Geico is going to be offering you 15% off in your car insurance. The other thing to realize is people have what's called the 30-second button. On most podcast apps, there's that little round button that says 30 on it. And if you tap it, you go fast forward 30 seconds. So most ads that pop up, boop, people will just skip through it as well. But yeah, if you're looking to monetize that way, you can. You're going to get nickel and dimes to the beginning. But if you can get, a couple of 100,000 people downloading your podcast, you can make some money there. Other people look for sponsorships. Others put their podcast behind a paywall. Now, this usually works better if you already have a lot of followers. Say you've got 200,000 Instagram followers and saying, okay, I have a special podcast only for my followers. You can go on Patreon. Apple Podcasts is now offering a special subscription service starting, I think, next week, actually. And Spotify also lets you put your podcast behind a paywall. But you better already have a lot of followers because, again, 2 million podcasts. No one's going to want to pay for something they can get for free unless you offer something really unique. Barack Obama says, hey, pay $5 a month for my podcast. He's going to make it. Joe Schmo, maybe not.
Right. I always think sometimes it is a little bit of a popularity game. You do have to have the followers. You do have to have the audience. Do you think when it comes to advertising, just one other question, do you think that if people who are doing podcasts decide to go that way, maybe have some, Geico pop in or whatever, do you think that that's a distraction from the podcast itself and the content that you're putting out?
It could be. Most of the podcasts I listen to don't have ads. And so I'm vaguely startled when I hear an ad start up. So yeah, that's when I whip out the 30-second button and go through. And it also depends on the kind of ad, because honestly, if you're part of a network, you don't always get to decide what ads show up on your podcast. So again, I listen to a lot of hockey podcasts and they automatically assume anyone who listens to a hockey podcast is a guy. So I'll be listening to a hockey podcast and suddenly they're talking about manscaping. It's just like, yeah, delete, forward.
Yeah. So for those people who are listening today, what do you think are the biggest challenges that could come up for them when starting their own podcasts?
Primarily, again, pod fade is the biggest thing. The podcast can be a major time suck. That's why people hire me. I can either work with them as a consultant and talk them through setting up their own podcast, or they do all the prep work, they interview, and I do all the work. They just have to show up and talk. And I'll do the editing. I'll make sure the sound quality is right. I'll edit out all the ums, ahs, you knows, likes, and the like. I'll turn it into an RSS feed. I'll get it up on all the various and sundry places. I also help market it. I create what's called audiograms, which are little snippets of the podcast that you can put on social media as teasers saying, wow, doesn't this sound cool? Click here to listen to the whole podcast. So that's where I work with my guys. But it's a time sink. And if you have the time, then great. It's a lot of fun. You don't have to do it every day. You don't have to do it every week. I know some people that do a quarterly podcast. It's like 4 hours long. I also know these two guys that do a 2.5-hour podcast twice a week. So again, it really depends on why you want to do it. What do you think you're going to get out of it? If you're just doing it for fun, one of the podcasts I used to listen to was these 3 Canadian girls watching the original Star Trek and talking about it. And it was really funny because one was a Trekkie and one had never seen a single episode of Star Trek. And she was in HR. So she kept yelling about, Starfleet HR and where the hell are these regulations?
Yeah, that's funny. So I want to thank you. And again, I'm not going to ask you to tell more about what you do because you just shared that. And if anybody wants to get in contact with you or they're like, I'm thinking of doing a podcast, but I don't want to do it. I just can't do it myself. I need help with it. So how can they get in contact with you?
They can go straight onto my website, which is smithdouglas with 2 S's.com. That'll give you an overview of who I am and what I do. And you could also contact me directly there. You can also register straight onto my calendar and we'll sit down and talk for half an hour and I'll get a better idea of who you are, what you want to do, and where you want to go from there.
Great. And I'll also put it in the description too. Thank you, Meryl, again, for just adding some light to this whole podcasting thing. One of the biggest things Meryl said is, when it comes to planning, you really do have to know your why. And with any program that you start or anything, any business that you're going to run, anything that you're going to do that's going to either make you money or not make you money, you have to know your why. Take time to get to know your why there. If you want to start a podcast, know that concrete, do I want to do this myself? Do I have time to do this myself? Or do I want to hire someone? And I think it's really important because, again, time is money and you have to know what your bandwidth is. Again, thanks for listening to the Biz Gone Social podcast. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and you can contact me at Lorraine@bizgonesocial.com. And I'll see you next week. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Biz Gone Social podcast. Find us on Instagram at Biz Gone Social for extra tips. Check back weekly for new episodes. Until next time, stay social.